Anti-government protests and pro-government rallies. Tensions are rising in Iran. Some Iranians are demanding action, while others are supporting the government. What's causing the turmoil, and how are Iran's leaders responding? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the last week, Iran has been hit with a wave of protests against the government that began with many demanding action over economic issues like the cost of living and unemployment. Some of the demonstrations turned deadly, with reports of more than 20 killed. The unrest is one of the biggest challenges to Iran's leadership, which has faced since the disputed presidential election in 2009. But tens of thousands have also attended pro-government rallies. Leaders have pointed to outside interference. And on Wednesday, the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the defeat of what he called sedition in his country. For much more on all of this, I'm joined now by Reza Marashi. He is the research director for the National Iranian American Council. Also joining us from Massachusetts is Kaveh Afrasiabi. He is an author and political scientist and is an expert on Iranian foreign affairs. With us too in the studio is Dorothy Parvaz. She is the global politics reporter at ThinkProgress. And also joining us from California is Alexander Azadgan. He is a professor of international political economy and a senior geopolitical analyst. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Reza, let me start with you. So we have these demonstrations going on for almost a week right now, and we've heard different reasons on why they have been taking place. Some say economic, others say anti-government. What's your view?
Oh, I think that you can't really separate the economic from the political and the social. And I think a very diverse socio-economic swath of Iranian society would say that their political, economic, and social aspirations have not been met for quite some time, at least not to the degree that they should be. And that's what typically causes protests to pop up in some iteration. And I think it's also important to point out that oftentimes we look at protests that break out, say, in 1999 or in 2009 after Iran's presidential election. There have been a lot of much smaller protests taking place in a variety of cities over very core economic issues for quite some time. So while I don't think that this is necessarily a revolutionary moment in its current iteration, I do think it's something that the Iranian government should take very seriously.
Does it pose any threat to the Iranian government?
I don't think in the short term it does, but I think over the medium to long run, if political and economic and social grievances are not fully addressed in a comprehensive and tangible way, then it causes a greater number of people to be unhappy. And then at that point, who knows?
Kaveh Afrasiabi, the commander of the country's Revolutionary Guard, has called this sedition. What do you think is behind the unrest?
Well, I agree with your guest in Washington, D.C. about the socioeconomic nature of the political mass rallies that have popped up in various parts of the country. And, you know, one has to look at the nature of the Iranian government, its distribution of wealth through the subsidies, and all the social services and economic programs that, devote the lion's share of the government's budget. And there's a discrepancy between public demand and the sense of entitlement and the government's revenues in light of the declining oil revenues, as well as the fact that Iran continues to be a sanction-hit country despite the nuclear accord, partly as a result of the lack of commitment by the Trump administration, who's shedding crocodile tears for the Iranian people nowadays, and is partly to blame for the suffering of the Iranian people. So I don't think that all the blame should be squarely put on the Iranian government. Part of it is also directed at the United States that has been dragging its feet on its obligations on the Iranian nuclear accord and has been lobbying the Europeans not to trade with Iran and so on and so forth. So a mix of internal and external factors come into play, and one has to take into consideration the role of third parties, regional states. Iran has an array of enemies that seek to exploit internal discontent for their own sinister purposes.
Dorothy, Do we know what the situation is right now? These demonstrations have been going on for about a week. The head of the Revolutionary Guard says what he called the sedition has been defeated. But do we know what's going on?
Well, I mean, I checked Iranian media before I came in tonight, and it seems pretty quiet on the streets. There might be small protests popping up here and there still, but it's late there, so probably nothing happening. Friday will be the day of reckoning because that's usually when a lot of the protests get going again. Although I think that given the desperate and leaderless nature of these protests, it's unlikely that you're going to see a huge sort of showing in any particular city, but I'm not sure.
Does it surprise you that the government was able to mobilize so many supporters in such a short space of time? We're seeing a lot of demonstrations now from pro-government supporters.
Not at all. And that's not necessarily because I think all these people really support every aspect of this government. But you have to understand that a large percentage of the Iranian population, knows the neighborhood really well, knows the region. They don't want instability in their country, so they might want changes made, but they don't want violence in the streets. They don't want regime change in such a sort of dramatic, fast fashion. So, and they certainly don't want foreign interference. So they're going to rally and show support for their government at this point. That makes perfect sense, right?
Right. Alexander, let's look at the economic picture in Iran right now. There was a report that said that Iranians have become 15% poorer over the last decade. The unemployment rate is officially at 13%, but in some areas it's as high as 60%. You've got inflation, which is running at about 10% as well. How big a challenge are these issues for the government?
It's a gigantic challenge. Just to add to what your other guests were asserting, in addition to what they were asserting, we could conclude that if the economy is not looked upon in a very serious strategic national interest matter, then these so-called protests, in many cases they are nothing but mayhem and anarchy, will pop up in a few years again. So we need to go through major economic reform. A big chunk of it is up to the Iranians. You have to understand this is an extremely complicated situation. It's not just internal economy, it's geoeconomic and geopolitical. You definitely cannot separate the political element of this conflict from its economic roots. 80% of the protesters, my sources tell me, were under the age of 25. The employment market for these folks is looking grim. And it's not just because of economic management issues within Iran. You have to understand that at the end of President Ahmadinejad's administration, this is the last president, the Iranian currency was collapsed and it had 25% of its worth. In other words, instead of 1,000 tomans to a $1, it became around 4,000 tomans to a dollar, which is where it's staying at, 4,200 to be exact. So, and the other thing you talk about economics, the Rouhani administration, President Hassan Rouhani, who has just got reelected, his entire platform and the symbolic key that he held in his hands was to unlock this economic grid. All the promises that he made, which were rather lofty, I believe he was imitating a lot of promises we get here in the United States, which never come to actuality, which never come to manifestation. A lot of these promises didn't happen, unfortunately, because of our colleagues in Washington reneged on JCPOA. And our European colleagues unfortunately follow suit, even though Davos showed a contrast in the beginning. So Iran only got $1.7 billion, which was owed to it. This is a manipulated misperception that unfortunately the Trump administration keeps talking. The actual number is over $100 billion that is owed to Iran. So that money didn't come in, it wasn't funneled in, and the situation continues. If this situation is not resolved, if we don't have a 5-year plan to resolve the economy in Iran, I'm afraid these disturbances, anarchies, riots, mayhem, protests, whatever you're going to call it, they're going to manifest themselves again.
Okay, Dorothy, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, a 5-year plan is really ambitious for a mess that's taken decades to make, but I think people would be happy to see any kind of plan, probably, at this point. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that what people are protesting against, those who are concerned with the economics in the country, as my panelists pointed out, co-panelists, they're young, so unemployment for people under the age of 29 for men is like 25%, for women it's 50%. So these are high numbers, right? And then you look at where the government is spending money on their new budgets. The new budget has high allocation for religious institutions, for the IRGC, but at the same time cuts subsidies going to Iranians, everyday Iranians. So this is all building up at the same time as the country is spending a lot of money being involved in overseas endeavors in Syria, maybe in Lebanon. I don't know how much they're spending anywhere else. I mean, these are black box numbers. We don't know.
Right.
But money is being spent. So the frustration that people feel is very real, and it's not just one thing. I mean, when you go to a rally in D.C., you know, you might see 100 different types of signs with 100 different types of grievances. I don't know why people expect a very large, complex country to have one problem and have one protest over it.
Right. Reza, to what extent is the problem for President Rouhani the fact that he may have overpromised and underdelivered? There may not be a dividend from the nuclear deal.
Well, I think it's safe to say that President Rouhani overpromised. I think it's also safe to say that former Obama administration officials overpromised on what Iran's economic deliverance would be as a result of this deal. And overpromising in that regard is quite common in politics, but in the case of Iran, given the economic stranglehold that it had faced as a result of nepotism, mismanagement, corruption, and foreign sanctions, particularly from the United States, caused a very difficult situation to become quite worse. And here's where I'm trying to be fair to President Rouhani. It's not like he hasn't tried. He's faced a variety of obstacles from unelected officials and institutions that have hamstrung him, to put it diplomatically, really every step of the way. And I think these recent protests are another example of that. I mean, Dorothy very accurately commented on President Rouhani leaking a copy of the budget. Right. And that's how we know that religious institutions and all these other numbers came out. And he gave a speech less than a week ago, if I'm not mistaken, that came out and said, look, you know, there's 5 or 6, financial institutions that somewhat resemble a Ponzi scheme. You know, anywhere between 4 to 6 million Iranians could be adversely affected if these go belly up. And he went to the supreme leader and talked about it as well. So these are all instances in which he's tried, but vested and powerful economic interests in Iran are trying to make sure that he doesn't achieve his objectives moving forward. And frankly, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't even agree with all of his economic objectives, because he's very much a neoliberal when it comes to economics. And I think that if Iranians had a choice, for example, if Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders ran for president in Iran, they'd get a lot of votes.
When you say he's been hamstrung, why would these elements try to place obstacles in front of his program? I mean, is it a political turf war that we're seeing there?
It's certainly part of a political turf war, but I don't think you could separate the economics from it as well. I think you have a lot of extremely wealthy, extremely powerful people who, don't really have prominent public positions within the Islamic Republic, who were writing President Rouhani letters saying, you know, maybe you should take a step back, maybe you shouldn't pursue this anti-corruption drive, maybe you shouldn't do this. And not just to President Rouhani, people went to the supreme leader as well and said, maybe this isn't the best course of action. And to President Rouhani's credit, he has continued to pursue it. Now, it remains to be seen, given the protests that have broken out across the country, even if they're a bit smaller in size than 2009, whether or not he's going to be empowered internally to say, see what happens when you don't listen to me. We need to start making these kinds of changes. Long story short, there's a small but greedy number of officials inside of Iran who don't want to share the pie with the rest of the country.
Kaveh, initially when these protests broke out, we heard President Rouhani, and he appeared to sound pretty conciliatory. He was saying the protesters have a right to protest. He was saying they can criticize the government if they want to, but that changed. There's now been a crackdown. What do you think changed?
I don't necessarily agree that it has changed. The nature of the protest itself changed from peaceful to violent, and we saw the role of criminal elements, hooligans, and some agent provocateurs. And the dust has yet to settle on these events before we get a full picture of what has been happening these past several days. But I don't agree with the initial statement by your reporter that tension is rising. I, on the other hand, think that tension is subsiding, that this was a passing storm. President Trump and other U.S. officials expected a Category 5 hurricane, but instead we ended up with a tropical storm, and barely more than a tempest in a teacup. It is not comparable to the 2009 events and the turmoils that followed the election there. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that the Rouhani government is going to draw from this, one of which is that we have a rising class inequality and the Rouhani administration, and pent-up frustration by the working classes and the poor. Some 20% of the population live below the poverty line. And this is far from the ideal of the Islamic Revolution and the founding principles of the Islamic government, and something has to be done to remedy the growing class inequality.
Right. Okay.
And there's a whole number of other issues that are on the plate for reconsideration and review by the government, and we heard from one of the cabinet ministers today saying that there was a fruitful meeting and there's going to be, a review of policies and, and the budgetary priorities.
Dorothy, do you agree that the worst is over? Tensions have eased?
I mean, if you look at it short term in terms of what's happening in the streets, yeah, sure, maybe. But these people aren't going to disappear just because they're off the streets. In fact, now they all know each other. They're now following each other on social media. They know how to find each other. And so maybe the next time they protest, the next action they take will be more organized. I don't know if they'll be politically motivated, economically motivated, a mix of both, but I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon.
Okay, we need to take a quick break right now. Much more on the tensions that Iran is dealing with when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.